All right, good morning, everybody. This is the My Jewish Learning's Daily Dose of Talmud, weekly Daf Yomi in review. We're so delighted to be joined this morning by Rabbi Elliot Goldberg. Rabbi Goldberg, I'm going to pass it over to you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see some of the regulars say hi and where you're from in the chat. It already started, and once again, we have a collection of time zones, which is just awesome. Good to see you guys this morning as we try to hit on some highlights of this week in Daf Yomi. We're in the heart of Masechet Chagiga, which, if you've been following, you know is about the sacrifices that we bring to the temple during the holidays. The Torah tells us when you come to the temple, don't come empty-handed. My mom told me that too, right? When you go to someone's house for Shabbat dinner, bring a bottle of wine, bring some flowers, bring a challah, bring some rugelach. Well, on the holidays, the temple sort of works the same way. You got to bring an offering when you show up. Well, my teachers in rabbinical school would have said, you're not allowed to have favorite and least favorite, masechtot, because, we're supposed to love all of them equally. But I have to say that Masechet Chagiga, I find, I'll put it in the upside. The upside is it's short, so we're not in it for so long. But I find the texts that are actually about the Chagiga offering are just not so, they don't grab me. And after a few pages of exploring what should we bring and how much and what does it look like and how is this sacrifice different from the other one and how long do we have to bring it, I'm like, enough. But then there's this week, because the last Mishnah of chapter 1 and the first Mishnah of chapter 2, which aren't directly related to the Chagiga, are sort of these gems in the middle of Masechet Chagiga. You wouldn't know they were there if someone didn't point them out to you. And I was really happy when someone did. And there's some absolute lovely conversations about them in the Gemara, and they appear this week. I guess I should say, Rachel, I've had this conversation more with Julie when she was hosting. When does the week start and the week end for the highlights? Is it Thursday to Thursday because we do this on Thursdays, or is it Sunday to Shabbat? And it's a real Talmudic argument when the week begins and week ends. And this week I decided the week begins after the last highlights of last Thursday, because I really wanted to get the Mishnah in that we did on Shabbat, which some might consider to be last week. So if you fall on a different side of that Talmudic debate, when do the highlights begin? I apologize for that. The Mishnah that I'm talking about, of course, is one that is a conversation that the rabbis are having about what's the connection between rabbinic literature and Torah, right? We know the Torah is the source for what the rabbis bring. And we have a Mishnah at the end of chapter 1 that says, all that stuff about vows, which if you don't know all the stuff about vows, the Masechet about vows is coming. So I don't want to spoil it. It'll come. But the Mishnah says, we made that up. There's a lot of stuff about vows, but it really doesn't root itself in the Torah. And then there's other pieces of halakha that are like mountains held up in the air by a string, meaning there's a few verses in the Torah about them, and we have mounds and mounds and mounds, or mountains full of halachot. And then we have a whole series of things like sacrifices and purity and other laws that they say the essence of Torah, because the Torah is filled with details and the rabbinic layer just presents them back to us. And it's this great discussion about the connection between rabbinic literature and the Torah upon which it's founded. In that Mishnah we saw, I'm going to share my screen and start the slideshow. Rachel, did that work last time?
I can see you.
All right, you can see me.
If other folks are seeing differently, just throw it in the chat. We'll take a look.
You can see me and the slide.
Yep.
All right, excellent. So this Mishnah to which I'm referring, that's on Chagiga, page 10, I'm drawing from the middle that says, the halachot of Shabbat are like mountains suspended by a hair. as they have little written about them in the Torah, and yet the details of the halachot are numerous. And what's interesting in the Gemara that we saw is the Gemara has a different take, potentially, well, several takes from the Mishnah itself. Oh, I have a typo in the word Mishnah. Apologies for that. Here, we'll clear that off the screen. Oh, sorry, can't do that. I went too many screens. There we go. The basis of the statement that the Mishnah is making is, we find in the Midrash, or actually Rashi brings us really succinctly. One of the places where the laws of Shabbat are mentioned in the Torah is Exodus 35:2, which is right around now in Parshat Shavua, soon, but we're in the building of the tabernacle. And in the midst of the commandments about the building of the tabernacle, God says, on 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day, you shall have a Shabbat of complete rest, which is holy to God, and whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. And Rashi explains, which connects to the Mishnah I just had up on the screen, right? That God, he says, God intentionally mentioned the prohibition of work on Shabbat before the command to build the tabernacle in order to intimate that building of the tabernacle does not supersede Shabbat. Now, the Torah itself doesn't tell us that the building of the tabernacle doesn't supersede Shabbat, but Rashi is quoting the Midrash. Oh, the puppy doesn't like this teaching. Rashi's quoting the Midrash, which says, hey, here's how we know what it means to rest on Shabbat. And what Rashi explains is what the rabbis based their, in fact, what we study when we study Masachet Shabbat, this notion of the juxtaposition of the teaching about the Shabbat in the Torah to the instructions to build the tabernacle teach us anything we did to build the tabernacle, that's what you can't do on Shabbat. And for the most part, those are the laws of Shabbat, which it's already a couple years ago. We studied in detail, and we saw the volume of Masechet Shabbat that really came from this midrash about this one pasuk, where the Torah doesn't really give us any details of what it means to rest on Shabbat. A few here and there. You're not supposed to collect sticks, and you can't light a fire. Those are some of the specifics in the Torah, but most of the specifics aren't there. And the Mishnah, I'm going to unshare my screen for a second. The Mishnah that we saw before tells us exactly that, right? Shabbat is voluminous in the halacha, but yet at the same time, it's those details don't appear in the Torah. And the Gemara I find really interesting on this. It does a few things. There's one conversation that's sort of like a Monty Python skit. I don't know if you're Monty Python people, but the Mishnah says the laws of Shabbat are like a mountain hanging from a hair, and the Gemara sort of says, no, they're not. And the response is, yes, they are. No, they're not. Yes, they are. They do it in a British accent. I read that part, sort of saying, no, it can't be. Because we know the rabbis in the Talmud, different from this Mishnah, the Talmud really wants to connect all the things in the Mishnah directly to the Torah. So when the Mishnah says, we have all these laws that aren't really connected so directly to the Torah, their response is, no, they're not. Yes. And there's really not more to the sugya than that. I thought about bringing it, but it's, if you can picture John Cleese and one of his buddies just going, no, yes, that's sort of a back and forth because, and there's not really anything to hang that conversation on because I think the rabbis are right. The laws of Shabbat are really expansive. They are rabbinic creations. And the Mishnah is really comfortable saying that, but the Gemara less so. Although another take the Gemara has is to say, that's right, intentional creative labor you can't do on Shabbat, and and the Torah never says intentional creative labor you can't do on Shabbat. So actually this Mishnah is right. That's voice number 2 in the Gemara. And then the third voice says, well, no, it's not that. It's if you drag a bench and dig a dish inadvertently on Shabbat, you might have a problem, and that's not in the Torah. So it's true the laws of Shabbat are like a mountain hanging by a thread. that feels less accurate to me. But Rabbi's trying to say, I can find one rule of Shabbat that's not in the Torah, and that justifies the Mishnah saying it's a mountain hanging by a thread. But I actually think those texts tell us, it's a it's a small grain of sand hanging by a thread, which is much easier to support. So we see in this window of this Mishnah a little bit about the rabbis thinking about the connection between the halachot that they're creating, that they're shaping, and the Torah from which they're deriving these. And Shabbat in particular is an example where there's an expansion. What I love about the last Mishnah of chapter 1 is, though, it talks about other areas like vows that I mentioned before, where the rabbis say there's not so much to lean on, and it talks about a whole series of other halachot, like sacrifices, which is the subject of our Masechet, where there are more details in the Torah, and the details that the rabbis explore, you could see the connection much stronger. So that's the end of chapter 1, which we dealt with this week, and that leads right into the beginning of chapter 2. Though I'm going to pause a second. I see a nice discussion of the dog barking and cats meows. The chat's always fun. Someone's asking.
Apologies about that. Rabbi Goldberg, do you think there's a connection to the story that's coming up about Rabbi Akiva, right? Because Rabbi Akiva is sort of really famous for deriving halachot on almost nothing, and we sort of come from this discussion of our halachot hanging almost by a thread, and then we come to this story that sort of glorifies him.
Oh, that's a really nice, I like that connection, right? Because Rabbi Akiva is known for the creativity of his midrashic ability, his ability to use the principles of midrashic interpretation of biblical texts to create, shape Jewish law. It might be that there's that connection. I'm not sure. I find it really interesting in terms of the Mishnah, the transition from the end, this Mishnah at the end of the first chapter to the Mishnah at the beginning of the second chapter, which both don't relate so directly to the theme of Masechet Chagiga, both generate lots of conversation in the Gemara. I like that thread, that through line that you see, Rachel, that Robby Akiva, who's able to do that, he's able to create a mountain of interpretation and law from a small thread in the Torah, and they're definitely praising that, and that might be partly what puts all the stories about Akiva that are coming here. But I think they're also attached to the next Mishnah, which I don't see the same through line in. But sometimes, the Gemara's editors and the Mishnah's editors have different through lines that they're connecting. But I really like that. There's a good, you should write about that for...
Laura Shapiro also, I wanted to highlight her comment. She mentions that the mountain hanging by a thread reminds her of the Midrash of the inverted Mount Sinai being held over the head of all of Israel. And they're told, the famous Midrash, they're told, accept this Torah or I will drop this mountain on you and this will be your grave. Another famous hanging mountain in rabbinic literature.
And I know some people whose Jewish approach to Judaism says, right, this mountain of the mitzvot that the rabbis created feel like a burden hanging above their head that they're about to crush me right now. So, some people love how the rabbis created that mountain, and they love hiking up it and around it. And some people feel like holding it, they feel the weight of it on their shoulders, and it doesn't fit as true. So I like that. That's a nice connection too to that midrash. And I bet that image of the mountain hanging there, that the rabbis have that in mind when they use the image in both places, that's another connection that that you might draw, that that the rabbis were familiar with that as well. All right, I'm going to go back to my screen. We're going to jump to chapter 2 because of course we're in the highlight sprint through a week. And I'm going to go to my next slide. Because the next Mishnah talks about, also about Torah a little bit, but it talks about forbidden sections of Torah, parts of Torah that maybe we're not supposed to study, or we're not supposed to study the same way, or that we might be, or things that might be dangerous to study, period. And one of the things that this Mishnah teaches is one may not expound the topics of forbidden sexual relations before 3 or more individuals. Meaning, here's a topic in Torah, right, about what are permitted and what are forbidden sexual relationships that you might have. And you need to have a very small class to teach that. And there's a conversation in the Gemara that tries to explain why. And one of the things that I love, you'll have to indulge me because during the pandemic, I spent some time in middle schools teaching. And I think as a teacher in middle school, the Gemara is right on here about an important piece about how students learn. And I think it's true. I think it's true for math and science in addition to Torah and other topics. But the Mishnah says, we may not expound the topic of forbidden sexual relations before 3 or more individuals. And the Gemara asks, well, what's the reason for this? And the answer it gives, as a teacher, as I said, I love, it's based on logical reasoning, right? Why? When 2 students sit before their teacher and one of them is typically involved in discussion with his teacher, while the other lends his ear to the teaching. If there are 3 people, though, one is involved in a discussion with his teacher, and the other 2 are engaged in a discussion with one another. And they don't know what the teacher's saying, and so one day they might come to render permitted forbidden relations. Right? So the rabbis took seriously, right, the knowledge of, right, who you can have a sexual relationship with, and which is permitted and which are forbidden, and violating these rules is a big no-no in the Torah and for the rabbis as well. And they wanted to be careful that the students they were raising up knew these details well. And they have this very practical educational point. If you have 3 students and one student is engaged with you asking questions, the other 2 aren't going to pay attention. They're going to be talking to each other about something. The baseball box score, the whatever's in the news, did you get the Wordle today in 2 or 3 or 4 moves? And they're going to miss out on the conversation. And something I love about this conversation of this Mishnah is just it's true not just in the rabbinic classroom, it's true in our classrooms today. And as a teacher, this really resonates with me. But it sits in the middle of this Mishnah that talks about not just forbidden sexual relations that you're not supposed to study in large groups, but also you're not supposed to teach about creation before 2 or more students, meaning only 1 student at a time. And Maseh Merkava, the mystical passages from the book of Ezekiel, you're not supposed to teach really anybody unless they already understand that material on its own. This Mishnah generates a lot of really, 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 really interesting Gemara, and I would point you towards, if you haven't read them already, well, either the Gemara itself or the people who have written this week in the Daily Dose of Talmud, who have just done I thought, a fantastic job of writing about some of the different conversations about why the rabbis are restricting the study of Torah to small groups for these particular topics and all the things that come with it. But I want to dig a little deeper into the second half of the Mishnah, which says, whoever looks at 4 matters, it would have been better for him if he had never entered the world, right? Better not to have been in the world than to ask these questions. What's above? What's below? What's before? And what will be after? And the Mishnah says on top of that, anyone who has no concern for the honor of his maker, anyone who has no concern for God, deserves to have never come into the world. So this isn't Torah that's dangerous, but a speculation between what's above, what's below, what's before, and what's after. And most of the commentaries say, right, what's above, what's up in the heavens, and what's below, what's under the earth, realms that we've been able to explore in the modern era that the rabbis didn't have access to. Right, what was before? What's before creation? Or maybe what's before the Big Bang, you might ask? What will be after? What's the afterlife like? What happens after we depart the world? What happens to the universe after it implodes upon itself in billions of years? Those are questions better not to ask, says the Mishnah. And anything else that might tap onto show no concern to the honor of God. And this Mishnah leads to more stories about Rabbi Akiva and others that Rachel hinted at before, because a famous passage comes this week, just recently, about 4 rabbis who entered an orchard. Pardes is the Hebrew word used for that. And what the Gemara seems to be implying, somehow they dealt with the secrets of the Torah that brought them into dangerous space. And the 4 rabbis are Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, which is Elisha ben Abuya, and Rabbi Akiva. If you were here, I think about a month ago, the last time I was here for the highlights, I gave a hint. We saw just a regular text of Elisha ben Abuya, where he just taught some Torah like the rabbis in the Gemara. We hear more about his story this week. And we learn from whatever secrets of the Torah they seem to have explored or talked about as they were traveling in this orchard, physical or metaphorical. Ben Azai glimpsed and died. Ben Zoma glimpsed and was harmed, meaning he lost his mind. There's more stories about Ben Zoma and how he lost his sanity a little bit. Acher, Elisha ben Abuya, cropped down the shoots of saplings, meaning he cut off the shoots from their roots. He left his roots. He became a heretic, and only Rabbi Akiva came out safely. So as Rachel hinted, Rabbi Akiva was known for being able to provide a mountain of midrashim about one pasuk in the Torah, that he could even the sort of flourishes in the fonts of the Torah. He would do drashot on the crowns on letters. He was the only one to survive whatever it was this encounter was in the Torah. In the Pardes. The stories about Pardes are rich, and I encourage you to look at them here in this daf. And actually, Rachel wrote 14b for daily daf of Daily Dose of Talmud. You should check that out. But it led me to the following thought, which I'm going to close with, and then we'll open some things up for questions, which is we have a moment here where there's this very small story that has it's a little more expanded than what you see on your screen, but this ignites the imagination about the character, these 4 characters who went in the Pardes, why it was that they have a different result of whatever the encounter was, and lots of imagination about what the encounter was. And as people talk about the stories of these figures, this is a central chapter. That leads me to recommend two pieces of reading to you, which you may be familiar with, or you may not have been familiar with. One is a book called Rabbi Akiva, Sage of the Talmud by Barry Holtz. It's a recent attempt to pull together stories of Rabbi Akiva to try to get a sense of how the Talmud and Midrash present him and his story. It's also the opening chapter of this book that talks about the nature of Talmudic biography is, I think, really important if you're interested in, if you're thinking about how do we take Talmudic literature and learn about the lives of the rabbis. I think Barry Holtz in his opening chapter, before he starts talking about Akiva, does a masterful job about sharing what we've learned from modern scholarship, which is the Talmud is literature, not biography. And while you can collect the stories of the rabbis and try to place them in chronological order, you're sort of painting a picture of the stories about the rabbis more than you are about their history or their biography. And with Robby Akiva in particular, depending on which story you read, there's some differences about in just basic factual information, who he was married to when he came into the rabbinic fold. There are a lot of famous stories about him, and they don't always line up in terms of biographical details. And Barry Holtz does a great job in this book dealing with it, and he treats the Pardes story, which is in this week's on page 14 of Chagiga. And connected to that, my favorite of the books about what happened in Pardes is Yochi Brandis's The Orchard. I like the Hebrew title better. She calls it HaPardes Shel Akiva, Akiva's Orchard. It's in some ways a retelling of the story of Rabbi Akiva and what happened in Pardes. I'm not sure why Akiva's name was dropped from the English title, but I don't know a lot about marketing of novels for the Jewish audience in the American setting. But The Orchard is a great telling of and retelling of many famous Talmudic stories with a focus on Rabbi Akiva and the others who went into Pardes. And of all the commentaries or explanations that I've ever read about what actually happened in Pardes that led one person to leave Judaism, one to drop dead, one to lose his mind, and only Akiva came through it. Yochi Brandis's take on what really happened in Pardes is my favorite. And it's not something I would have thought of all by myself. And once I got to the chapter about 3/4 of the way through the book and she revealed it, I was like, oh my God, that's awesome. I'm not going to spoil it. You should read the book. It's a great read. All right. Oh, I see some other suggestions, right? As a Driven Leaf is also a telling of that story. I loved that as a teenager, as I read it again as an adult, and maybe partially influenced by my wife, who was a literature major in college. As a Driven Leaf is a great retelling of the Talmudic stories, and you see echoes of Talmud in it. And it's a great sort of book about the faith and theology. It's a tough, as a novel, it's not a great novel. It's better for its theology than for its literary quality. But As a Driven Leaf is a classic, and mid 20th century, it was a great thing there.
It was also interesting to me that As a Driven Leaf takes the mysticism angle out of everything.
Yes.
Right? It's not about mystical endeavors. It's not about trying to see God, as it clearly is in the Gemara, but there it's really about delving into Greek philosophy and natural philosophy, I think.
Yeah, well, Milton Steinberg was a student of Mordechai Kaplan in the Reconstructionist movement, and part of Mordechai Kaplan's theology was about, God is not, it was a rejection of mysticism, right? Reconstructionist Judaism is about, finding God in ourselves. Right, finding God as we move towards perfecting the world, and not God as a mystical source. So it makes sense knowing, where the book, where the author was sitting in the spectrum of Jewish theologies as he wrote the book. But yes, it's a great exploration about Jewish truth and secular truth and how we try to resolve them together. And for me as a teenager who was thinking about, what do I believe of all the Jewish stuff that I'm learning and all the other stuff that I'm learning, and how do I put it together? As a Driven Leaf was, for me as a teenager, a powerful treatment of that. I see. I meant to leave us a few more minutes for questions.
So there's one that we didn't really get a chance to treat in the Daily Dose. It also occurred to me when I was reading these pages this week, so I wanted to highlight it. Sorry, I've lost it. Let me see if I get. Yeah, so Mary Jean Suzman, I apologize if I mispronounced your name, points out that the rabbis will say things like, we don't talk about what is above and what is below. We don't talk about what comes after and what comes before. And then they talk about it. Right. And likewise, I noticed this with the Merkavah mysticism, which, as we learned, is a deep study of Ezekiel 1, right? The prophet Ezekiel has this vision of God's throne. And if you study it really deeply, you can understand what the throne looks like. And they tell us all these stories about how dangerous this is, and the student does it, and the fire comes out and burns him, and it's very dangerous endeavor. And then if you read further in the page, they start talking about, well, what does the throne look like? And they start doing exactly that.
Yes, that's a great comment, right? And then the question is, right, did they really, right? We know the rabbis think about what comes after what came before, right? This touches on, in some ways it's connected maybe to the Elisha ben Abuya story, and there's a note in the comment about that, right? Some of looking at the heresy, the Elisha ben Abuya's heresy, right? He became a heretic and he left the fold. Some of the answers to the questions, what came before, what came after, what's above, what's below, are dangerous, not because lightning will come out of the sky and strike you down, like one of the stories in this week's Talmud is, but they're dangerous because some of the answers the rabbis didn't like. So the answers I think they provided in the Talmud are when they talk about it, they're in the comfortable realm of interpreting it, right? But when you go to that realm of like, well, what came before, right? And you maybe explore that, well, maybe there is no creator, maybe there is no God, that gets to dangerous territory. When they talk about it, they don't go there, or at least if they went there, those texts didn't make it into the Talmud. But I like that nod to the irony of don't study this, and now we're going to tell you, and now we're going to study it. I think that's a good take, and actually, that's part of what I love about it. Feels like you stumble into a secret in these pages in the Talmud. We're not supposed to study it, but they just told us what they don't want us to know. It's like a kid in a candy store that way. There's something fun about these pages, and for me in particular, this week was there are Daf Yomi, there are all kinds of weeks. Some weeks are a real grind for me with some of the details that I don't find as compelling. And as I said in the opening, sometimes Masechet Chagiga is that. But it's weeks like this where you find like this oasis of story and different kinds of material, right? The materials we see here, there are hints of them in other parts of the Talmud, but there's a real concentration because of these two Mishnayot that we started with today that lead to just some wonderfully compelling and unique pages of Talmud that for me are a highlight of at least the 2+ years so far, and I imagine will be when I look at this, when we get to 7.5 years. Like, I think it'll be this week that stands out in part as one of the weeks of like, oh, I'll do that. I might not do Daf Yomi again, but I'll do these 10 pages again. All right.
All right, I think we're gonna wrap it here. We're at time. Thank you for all of your wonderful comments and questions. Thank you, Rabbi Goldberg, for sharing your learning with us and helping us to revisit some of the really interesting things that happened this week. By the way, Rabbi Goldberg, there was a request for your slides. So maybe if before we could go, maybe you could pop those into the chat. Is that a possibility, or is that too complicated?
Let me see. I'd have to. Yeah, hang on. I think I can do that. Oh, wait. I'm going to share. Yes, I know how to do this.
Okay, so I will leave this running for a minute so we can share the slides with I can't recall which person asked for those, but we'll get those into the chat for you.
So that's fine. So in theory, I put in the chat, this is the link to the Google Doc, and I set the settings so that anyone with the slides can see them. I hope I did that right. Restricted only people added can, oh, hang on. I didn't do it right. I'm changing right now. Anyone with the link can view.
Yep. Okay. So, Rabbi Goldberg, you sent it as a direct message to me. So let me put it as
I sent as a direct message to you. Sorry. Here, I'll do it again.
Send it to everyone.
I did it again. Oh, I did it again. It's a direct message to you.
Okay. I'll pop
it
into this.
Sorry. Okay. Pardon me for the.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. So great to see you. I will just leave this open for a minute in case anyone wants to grab that link. And we will see you tomorrow on the page and next week here.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Bye, everyone. All right.